Hello, I'm Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. And thank you for attending our session on future directions in research and training for digital history, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of Virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support Virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat at the end of the session. A few logistical things to cover before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but also need to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be a part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording on the AHA's YouTube channel after the session. I'd now like to turn things over to the chair of the session, Jennifer Guiliano from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. As Debbie said, I'm Jen Guiliano. I'm an associate professor of history at IUPUI, and I'm a co-director of the Humanities Intensive Learning and Teaching Institute, which is one of the digital humanities training institutes. So I was sort of asked to chair the panel in part because I spend a lot of time thinking about pedagogy and teaching in the variety of different circumstances that we can have. So today what we have is a roundtable about possibilities and challenges. And as you can see from our speakers on the screen, it features those with both disciplinary and interdisciplinary training, as well as various types of engagement in digital history. How the panel is going to work today is that each panelist is going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes initially with some remarks. And then we're going to be sharing some questions that we have from the discussion, hopefully discuss a little bit, and then bring forward questions out of the audience. So if at any time you have a question that a panelist sort of raises for you, feel free to put those into the Q&A and we'll share those as we go. Right now, I think we're thinking about sort of a 60 to 75 minute long panel. Hopefully, if things get really exciting, we may stretch it a little, but just in case you're planning. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone for doing this, especially the panelists. Trying to organize and be involved in anything during COVID is incredibly difficult. And for these panelists who have all kinds of different obligations, I'm just so appreciative that they stepped forward. So our first panelist today is going to be Zoe Leblanc at Princeton University. She is a postdoctoral associate and Weld Fellow at the Center for Digital Humanities, where she works in their lab. Previously, she was a digital humanities developer at the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia, where she built web applications for mapping and data visualization. She also taught undergraduate, graduate, and faculty fellows at UVA. She is also the author of an incredibly rich and useful intensive programming course, which you can find on GitHub. Zoe's our first panelist. Zoe.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna quickly try and share my slides here. Hopefully you can all see that. So today I'm gonna talk hopefully very quickly. I might go fast, so please feel free to post questions in the chat if something's unclear. But I wanna talk a little bit about the futures for computational and digital history. And this is kind of a weird question probably for those of you not really on Twitter too much. But this really came out of partially Ben Schmidt's talk 2 years ago. I guess it was 2 years. 2019 feels like a decade ago, but 2 years ago at the AHA on this panel about the legacies of cliometrics. And during that panel, he gave this really kind of provocative, really great talk, talking about kind of the futures for intensive computational work in history and digital history kind of specifically. And he has this great quote, "Computational is dead for good." And you can actually read the talk. It's a fantastic talk. He posted it on his blog. But I thought that was an interesting moment because kind of at the same time on Twitter again was the emergence of this kind of research community called computational humanities research, right? And this was largely driven kind of out of European digital humanities, a lot of digital historians there, and then kind of digital humanists that weren't in digital history as much. And I thought this was a really interesting kind of combination, right, of these threads coming together, and raises a lot of questions about, for me at least, what is the future of digital history specifically within kind of the North American Academy. Now, these were the questions I had when we first proposed this panel, which was a while ago, right? Since then, obviously, things have become more intense in terms of what is going on with the history job market, which is what this graph is. It's kind of showing the absolute collapse in some ways of history hiring. And then on top of that, we have COVID, right? And I kind of want to place these front and center because we're talking about future directions of the field. And I don't think there's any way we can talk about that without, you know, grappling with this graph, right? And so I bring it up too, because there was a lot of pushback initially on Twitter about anything called computational history. And so I want to take a moment to kind of just qualify a bit about what I'm trying to do here by bringing this up, which is, you know, not trying to, for example, gatekeep digital history. We tend as academics to get into these weird kind of small fiefdom wars. And I think there can actually be kind of a multitudes of digital history, and that's what makes the field so rich. So can we talk about computational history without kind of gatekeeping is one question I have. Another question though is acknowledging kind of the power that comes with computation in that term. And I'm going to talk about that a little later in my talk, but I think it's something that we actually need to address. We can't just elide over. And I have this Venn graph here because that workshop I was talking about has happened now. When I first proposed this panel, it hadn't happened. It was this kind of, you know, what could happen moment. And actually looking at the participants, there's very few digital historians. There's essentially none from North America, right? There's some from Europe and the UK. And that could just be, you know, it's a pandemic. People are busy. There's all sorts of weird ways in which research develops, right? But this got me looking also at the Journal of Cultural Analytics and at the kind of comparison to that with current research in digital history. And when you look at that, there's some overlap, like Jennifer has a great piece in it, Joe Gouldy, Lauren Klein are also in Journal of Cultural Analytics, but there is kind of this distinct emergence. And so I want to talk about that today a bit. And, you know, I don't want this to be an attack on what Ben said. He actually, in this tweet and kind of longer threads, really qualified by what he meant with computation here. And he's really talking about kind of the more kind of heavy statistical modeling work. And so I want to kind of take that into account here. We're not talking about all forms of digital, we're talking specifically. But I think it is a real question for the field of what happens if we don't do this work, right? Can we actually parse computation to only mean humanities programming and kind of web programming separate from humanities data analysis? I mean, I think short answer, we can do whatever we want, but I wanted to kind of quickly talk about the ways in which we're going to deal with computation and this kind of modeling question, regardless of if we intentionally want to or not. And I think this is going to be the other panelists. I'm hoping they kind of take up these questions. But one area that I think we're going to hit this is the blurring of the line between kind of how we archive sources and extract data from them, right? And where that interpretive line is. And this is a picture of Transcribus. This lets you kind of build handwritten text recognition models. This is an interesting question, right? Is this computation? It's modeling, right? It's heavy statistics at one level, but it's not really kind of the way Ben's talking about it here. So can we continue doing this without engaging with this computation? I think another trend here is DH tools are changing, the larger ecosystem here, right? On one hand, we have large kind of library services building their kind of tools to explore data. But on the other hand, a lot of the free initial DH tools that excited a lot of digital history research are, you know, kind of slowly sunsetting. It's difficult to sustain them. There's, you know, clear exceptions, Omeka, Zotero, but they've also gone a path that not many people can follow, right? And so this is a big question, I think. And finally, collaborations outside of history. I wanted to put this tweet here because Ben in his piece talks about essentially Lauren Tilton's work as an example of the type of digital history work that is doing this web programming, but she, in this great piece, talks about her work as being part of computational humanities. And I think part of this hinges on what is the future of collaborations if that's where all this computational work is going to happen for digital history. So I think The other people on the panel are going to take this up more fully. And so I'm probably running out of time, but I want to kind of spend my last few minutes or seconds talking about why we might want to actually engage with computational humanities. What's the reason, right? We could continue all these problems I talked about. They're things that are on the horizon, but we don't need to engage with this necessarily. Other disciplines are doing it better. It's going to take enormous amount of resources to build support for these things. So why engage with computational humanities? On one side, I think there's theoretical interventions that could be enormously useful to digital historians. In the last decade, a lot of the think pieces about the future of digital history have been really focused on the methodological problems we face of translating our work to other historians. These theoretical interventions, I think, can help a lot here. But I want to kind of focus immediately on the institutional interventions, because I think we have a real chicken and egg problem in digital history, specifically with training and teaching, right? We both have no one to teach these skills, but no one is training the future generation. How do we get out of this? And I think that potentially computational humanities or some sort of term leveraging this could help us, right? Could it help us advocate for more space to teach digital skills, right? And scaffold them into the curriculum beyond one course? Could it open up space for more collaborative teaching until we have a larger cohort of digital historians? But how does that force us to think about what the current digital history curriculum is, right? And this is emerging. It's very institutionally specific, but I think we've spent so much time talking about the methodological that we haven't really spent enough time on this institutional. And I think deriving from that is this could help us shift scholarly expectations. Right now, collaboration is a huge piece of digital history, which is amazing, but it's also not evenly distributed, right? We want people to train as digital historians, as graduate students, as undergraduates, but then we don't really make it possible to defend a collaborative dissertation, right? And that's just not available at most places yet. So if we are going to embrace collaboration, how do we kind of ensure it's actually sustainable? Or can we use this to clarify what's actually possible for one scholar? And final thing here, coming to my earlier point, is that computation is a tactical term, right? Just like digital, we are currently in this data computational boom bubble, massive reorganizations around this kind of heading of data science. Can we use this to actually get more resources into history departments, right? Coming back to that initial graph of the collapse of the academic hiring market, is this a chance for us to help students navigate more career paths? But at the same time, is there a way to do this without reinscribing these power hierarchies, right? How can we do this without diminishing all the other aspects of digital history? So I'm going to leave it there because I'm probably way over time. But thank you, and looking forward to the other panelists' thoughts.
Thanks, Zoe. Our next panelist today is Sharon Leon, who is an associate professor of history and digital humanities at Michigan State University, where she is a core faculty member of the Consortium for Critical Diversity in a Digital Age Research, or the CEDAR group. Prior to joining the history department at MSU, Dr. Leon directed the public projects at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. You can follow her ongoing work, including her cutting edge linked open data projects at sixfloors.org. Sharon.
Sixfloors.org, which I just blew up in a significant portion of it 10 minutes before we started this conversation. So you won't be able to see all of it. Let's put it that way. So thank you, Jen. And I want to thank Zoe too, because that her opening piece sort of sets the table and reflects really nicely with some things that I've been thinking about. I don't have any slides, but I have thoughts. So what I was thinking about in preparation for this conversation is that in 2013, I was part of a conversation about a research report developed by the scholars at the Ithaca group, Mellon-funded Ithaca group, which is, related to JSTOR and ArtSTOR and all of those sorts of things. And it was this research report on the research and methodological practices of historians in 2013. And the major claim of the Ithaca research report was a terrifying claim about the varying modes of intellectual control that historians have over the materials that they engage with and the ways that they do that. And, part of the outcome of that conversation was a call on my part for us to, as a field of people who are interested in digital history, to engage in exactly the kinds of things that we've just heard called for, which is the training of the serious and hardcore training of mid-career historians who don't maybe have the skills and or time to concentrate on learning digital historical methods in the way that they would make them good consumers of digital history work, good producers of digital history work, and good supporters and mentors for their students. And so now we're at that point where that's 8 years ago. It's hard to believe it's 8 years ago, but we haven't moved the needle enough. And as somebody who teaches sort of permanently for the last decade, has taught digital history methods, and only digital history methods, which is kind of a sad state about my status as a historian, but I'm the person who teaches digital history methods. I have spent that time thinking really in a kind of concentrated way about how to bring a group of learners from no experience to some literacy, to a point where they can start to learn some things on their own. And that, of course, the answer to that is very different when the group of learners is a set of general education undergraduates who are there filling a requirement and may not have had a history course, right? And so may not bring other kinds of methodological tools to the conversation about what digital history is. Very different than a graduate seminar that is an introduction to a possible slate of methods, that out of which, a particular graduate student might find one that addresses the research questions they want to pursue, or a set of mid-career faculty who are looking to go back to those undergraduates and be able to train them and to engage with their graduate students. In all of this, I've also been in the position to be somebody who tries to make tools that are somewhere also in that in-between zone, that allow folks who maybe don't have a ton of computational skills, a ton of command line experience, any of those sorts of things, to sort of get some digital history work off the ground. For the most part, that work appears from the outside to be in the service of scholarly publishing of collections, publishing of metadata, publishing of long form narrative interpretation. But over the last 5 years, that's not really where my head has been about digital history. Where my head has been about digital history has been in this space that Jen suggested of linked open data, and what linked open data can do for us, particularly as historians. And there's been a sort of long standing slow roll of the world towards linked data since Tim Berners-Lee sort of envisioned a linked data web in 2006. And it's because it's hard to make linked data if you don't know a lot about XML. And it's hard sometimes to consume linked data if you don't know how to write a SPARQL query. And so, we're getting to the point where we have a set of possibilities for scholars to enter some of these questions. And so I'm thinking more and more about doing data-driven history, and the ways in which historians may not think of their work with the data that arises out of the sources they interrogate as being the kinds of data that we can use for computational work. But when we start to talk to historians about thinking about the data that they create when they engage with the source as being as socially constructed as their other kinds of interpretations, then we have to start to think about how we provide a new set of digital literacies for certainly for graduate students, so that they start to think critically about what it means to create a data model that expresses the meaning, the semantic meaning of the data that they're engaging, of the sources that they're seeing, and to answer the research questions they have. And then what happens when we start to see the data that is produced as something that can be published and perhaps reused? Raises a whole set of documentation problems that I think perhaps we have not been very concentrated in talking to emerging scholars about how to appropriately document the kinds of choices they're making in the creation of their sort of what I like to call meso-level data. How much normalization are they doing? How much augmenting are they doing? All of those sorts of things. And so when we turn to something like the Journal of Cultural Analytics or the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which are opportunities to publish data sets and to have them be a publication, what does that bring to the general world of scholarship for historians? And how do we start to evaluate them, how to frame them, how to consume them as pieces of scholarship? And then what happens when those data sets get reused and augmented another time? So another layer of distance in our thinking about data.
Thank you, Sharon. Our next panelist today is Ian Milligan, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Waterloo. His primary research, if you don't know, is on how historians can use web archives as well as the impact of digital sources on historical practice more generally. He is the author of two of my favorite books, 2019's History in the Age of Abundance and 2015's Exploring Big Historical Data. You can follow his ongoing work at ianmilligan.ca. Ian.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Do you see my speaker notes or the other thing? Sorry.
We can see your slides.
Okay, but no speaker notes. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I've got a timer running, so I'll be quick. What I'll be speaking about over the next 7 minutes is We Are All Digital Now, the needed transformation of historical training. If you're just listening, I do have slides, but basically they're decorative slides and text that I will be using, so you can follow ahead just by listening to me as well. So what I'm going to do over these 7 minutes is really quickly think broadly about how I think the digital age is changing knowledge generation, how we can equip students to meet this challenge, and some quick reflections on how that might require sort of blowing up the silos of our universities. So what do I mean by the transformation of knowledge generation in the digital age? Well, I say we are all digital now because I really think traditional disciplines like history are clearly being transformed by the digital turn outside of the uppercase digital history field. But even if history, I think on the surface seems like a traditional discipline, we can see many examples of how it's being dramatically transformed by the digital turn. We Google search for sources and information. We retrieve digitized newspapers from the comfort of our home office. When we could travel in the olden days, we would take quick research trips defined by a week of taking photographs to examine at home. And in general, we're able to work with a massive amount of information that's being placed online. That on the one hand, this is really good. It's given us an increasingly global outlook. Here, a hat tip to our fellow panelist, Lara Putnam. And I say here in Canada, I see it's not uncommon to have an MA student not having to travel at all to a physical archive for the degree. In Canada, we have these one-year funded MA degrees that are great. It's not uncommon for our PhD students or faculty colleagues to take trips numbered in days as opposed to weeks. And I think crucially, we can see people are able to look across oceans to archival resources that have been digitized from really the first year of their undergrad onwards. Now, I think we're seeing a lot more attention paid to this in the age of COVID, but like with everything when it comes to the COVID pandemic, we're seeing it as an accelerator, but not an inventor of trends. That we're now seeing whole degrees, projects, et cetera, are being forced to be completed from home. So to sum up this, we're really seeing in 2 decades the transformation of historians from one of a discipline based in at least on part in the lived experience of researching in a place to one defined by sitting at a desk and Google searching, using JSTOR and ProQuest. And I think in the case of most students, uncritically stitching together what they find into a hellish mishmash of sources. I'm not saying it's their fault, like we all do that. And we're not really, I think, coming to the point of my talk, training them to do really otherwise. That if we look around us, the world is changing, it's terrifying. But I think if we actually started to think about what it means to equip students to deal with this digital age, we might also begin to think about how we could make the history degree more responsive to skills that benefit our students and societies. In other words, suddenly history, I think we can make very tangible cases about how They need to learn these skills to be better historians and better citizens. So what can we do to meet this challenge? How can we equip our students to work in the digital age? Well, I think on the first hand, we need a sense of algorithmic bias and awareness. Some of this is straightforward. Why is a search result number 7 on the first page of google.com versus 600, a distant page never seen by human eyes? Why was this newspaper, I'm using Canadian examples, but why is this national newspaper digitized, or this Toronto newspaper digitized, but not that one? Why was this material from this archive put on the internet and not that one? What processes go into the decisions that our archival colleagues and friends make in deciding what to digitize? Why is this book from the University of Illinois or Michigan in Google Books? Why is this one from a Canadian library not? In general, what information am I basing my decision on? Now, I think if many of our students and faculty colleagues went down this list and even just answered questions like what you see on this slide behind me, they'd be in very good standing about how they think about information. That once our students and our colleagues and others can become critical consumers of digital information and platforms, they're equipped to be better researchers, but also, in the case of our students, better citizens. The skills that it takes to be a good historian in the digital age are what it takes to parse COVID data, to parse electoral results, to parse our newspapers, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter feeds, thinking about how our world is transformed by algorithms. Mediation matters. I always bang my drum. That's what makes history special, is our understanding of context, and that extends to the digital age. How information is mediated, whether it's a newspaper from a search engine, from the original, from the clipping, that mediation of the source matters. And of course, we need context. We're used to working with information provided to us in our original order. We lose that when it's decontextualized in the digital age. Of course, finally, just a general discussion of digital literacy. That none of this is specific to history. We need to throw out the idea of the digital native, that we need to understand how machines shape our world around us. So in my last minute, I'll go apocalyptic. I'll say sorry to our friends in the agriculture industry. I think we need to do this by blowing up silos. The reason standing in the way of this transformation, I think, is really the balkanized university and the balkanized discipline. That history, we love content. I empathize with Sharon. I also teach methods, and I get it. But in general, we're sort of like the odd people out of the corner, because history is a content-based discipline. And we struggle with core method things that cut across all of our areas in our discipline. It's not just history, it's the entire university. At least in Canada, we don't have a strong traditional general education, so stuff that isn't germane to one discipline sometimes fall into the cracks. And as we go to new budget models, it really reifies departments, it really reifies faculties as business units. They're great in a lot of ways, but they're bad in that they inhibit this sort of interdisciplinary cooperation. So to conclude in my last 10 seconds, traditional disciplines are being transformed by digital technology. We need to rethink how we train our students to meet this challenge. And I think we need to rethink of how we're structuring our discipline and even our universities and the idea of liberal education in the 21st century. So thank you, and really looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Ian. Our final panelist to speak openly is Lara Putnam, who is the UCIS Research Professor and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh, where she writes on Latin American Caribbean histories. Currently, she is co-PI of a really interesting new project, Information Ecosystems, which seeks to advance critical understanding of where data comes from and how it is used, setting the present moment within a century-long history of information supply and its power-laden consequences. She also, if you are interested in local civic organizing and politics, happens to be one of the most prolific tweeters about how Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania politics work. And I am blushing because her work is just incredible for her advocacy that she's doing. So Lara, you're up next.
Great, thank you. And it's really exciting to be here with so many scholars who I've learned so much from, and intimidating to be following on, because I basically, want to just hold up a bunch of signs saying that I, agree with and want to reinforce everything that's been said. My focus in these 5 minutes is going to be to reinforce the point that Ian especially was making, that thinking critically about doing history in a digital age is not just a task for specialists, and it's not just a task for people who think of themselves as doing digital history or doing computational history. It's something that all of us need to be thinking about. Everyone who thinks of themselves as a historian, or all of us wearing the hats of historian or citizen, or trying to understand the social world around us from any discipline. And the part of that, I think that there are particular challenges and also particular opportunities for learning and thinking and taking the insights that we can create as historians and using them to reflect more broadly on sort of what I think is also what Ian is calling for here, sort of critical thinking about how the digital age is shifting information flows within our society, which has implications for scholars, but also for social life and political life more broadly. I want to just have a few words here about three different topics. One is how digitized sources and the digitization of sources changes what we do as scholars. The next is how born digital sources, the existence of born digital sources changes what we do and what's knowable or should be knowable for scholars. And then finally, thinking about curation as a topic that we need to, that has been under theorized by historians, although we depend on curation. And there's been extensive and important theorization of curatorial practice within the work of professional archivists that we should be reading and borrowing and learning from. But curation actually has implications for all of us in this era. Okay, so in regard to digitized sources, Ian has already mentioned this. There can be source digitization can both remove important context that helped us make sense of how the limits of sources. So if maps are digitized in such a way that we lose the information that was on the back about who made the map, for what purposes, what might have been left out, the digitized facsimile, although it's more accessible, it's going to be what we reach out to and use as scholars, but we're actually going to be missing crucial contextual information that we should be taking into account in order to make thoughtful use of that source. And the combination of digitization and web-based digital search makes it increasingly possible to ignore contextual information even when it's been gathered. The most obvious example of this is when books or other texts are digitized, and we can do a term search and grab just the paragraph that refers to the place or the person that we're interested in studying. But we're in a world of just analog reading, we would have had to read the 5 pages before that, at least skimming them, and the 5 pages afterwards, hopefully, in order to, and that contextual information would have been was traditionally part of what kept us as scholars from creating the kind of stitched together mishmash that Ian helpfully labeled for us. And so as we're relying more and more on algorithmic retrieval to access sources rather than human intermediaries or institutional intermediaries, we're still making our access to sources is still intermediated. It's just increasingly intermediated by algorithms. And we all need to know more about what those algorithms are doing, what they're finding, what they're leaving out, what they're prioritizing. So in some sense, thinking about digitized sources, there's the challenge, the core challenge is maybe one of information loss and making visible the lagoons, like making visible the gaps where information has been lost, but we may not be forced to confront those gaps. With born digital sources, in some ways, the core challenge is the opposite. It's information excess, right? So social life, as it's being lived out in digital platforms, creates too much information. Everything is captured. But should it have been, who controls it? Who has access to it? In some sense, this is what Shoshana Zuboff has described as the epistemic inequality that's generated by surveillance capitalism. And characteristic of this moment of our collective social life is the creation of these sort of semi-public, semi-private spaces in which interactions are happening and which are nominally privately owned, but being used for private interactions by people who don't own those spaces. For sure, that's true of Facebook, but it's true of other spaces as well. And so the whole apparatus governing research, which has traditionally, for all of its faults, has been a sort of product of collective scholarly deliberation and has really rested on notions of the public and the private that are just ill-fitting for this current moment, right? We don't have a good set of ethical guidelines of thinking about what counts as experimentation, about what kinds of research, what kinds of commercial research should be subject or might be subject to what kinds of the kinds of controls over privacy or over sort of the potential for injury coming from research that was generated for a world in which there was more of a distinction between the public and the private. For historians in particular, there's a dilemma that has to do with this ways in which digital information flows sort of cut across some of the traditional analog providers of partial privacy. So when source bodies that have been that had been partially shielded from public view because you had to go somewhere to find them. So for instance, oral history collections and so on, when those become digitized and and uploaded to the web, suddenly the private narratives that were partially shielded from public finding are thrust forward in a new way, creating new retroactive kinds of vulnerability that I think we as historians really need to grapple with. And I'll say that this was the topic of a really interesting recent article by Ari Joskowicz on the age of witness and the age of surveillance in the AHR. He kindly was interviewed for the AHR podcast in October on this topic. So thinking about how is our work as historians and our work as of the sort of impulse to capture the stories, the narratives of the past, actually creating retroactive vulnerabilities for people who might not and might never have consented to be made public to this extreme way that a web-based world makes public. And then as a final thought in regard to curation, I'll note that there's a phenomenon which is shaping the historical record and shaping our practice as historians in the same way it's shaping, or sort of parallel to the way it's shaping our personal lives, which is that as the cost of storage has dropped, it is increasingly in every dimension of our life, it makes more sense to keep rather than curate. And I think all of us know this if we compare how we keep our notes and research files and images now compared to what we ourselves would have done 5 or 10 years ago, we can see that we're doing less pre-curation. But of course, that's true of institutions as well. And so the fact that we're all increasingly incentivized, even if we don't realize it, to keep more stuff and rely on algorithms to do the work of retrieval means that the work of sort of expert curation, which is what I used to do when I kept certain letters and didn't keep other ones, and put certain things into a file over here and didn't put other ones here. That work of expert curation, if we start thinking about it, when we're self-curating our lives, involves the creation of sort of taxonomies that then shape our analysis, they shape our understanding. Part of what's so interesting for me about the points that Sharon was making about what she teaches is that you're using the intentional creation, the creation of linked open data sets forces us to think critically about these taxonomies that we're making. That sort of pushes in the opposite direction, I think in a really helpful way, from all of these technological forces which otherwise are making curation even less of a part of our daily practice, in ways that have both costs for sort of the long-term historical record, because you end up with a sort of a huge mass of stuff that is going to be much that, whether that's what's created by a government agency or an individual author, it's going to be, because of the undifferentiated nature of that which is kept, there's going to be inevitably more of an impulse to simply discard rather than keeping, because we're not going to necessarily have access to any meaningful form of retrieval that's going to make it seem like it's worth spending the time to find the gold within the dross. But there's also an impact on our our analysis is always depends on making choices about what's similar and what's not, what's more significant and what's less significant. And so thinking about ways to build that back into our practice of training as citizens and as historians, hopefully will help counter some of these really the trends that are otherwise moving, as I said, sort of similarly within our private lives, within our public lives, within our professional lives. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lara. Thanks to each of the panelists for their initial remarks. I think I want to start with a question that's in some ways a little bit simplistic. When Zoe started talking, she talked a little bit about the multitudes of digital history. And in each of your sort of remarks, I think you located digital history in a slightly different way, right? So Zoe was speaking more about sort of stats and modeling. Ian was speaking more about sort of web-based analysis. Sharon was speaking a little bit more in the library and information science and linked open data space. And Lara, I think you were speaking more in sort of an American studies sort of space. And I wonder for the audience, if you could talk a little bit about what you think is at stake for students in defining digital history in a very specific way. What is the positive of asking them to ground themselves very deeply in one of those spaces versus I think what we're seeing a lot of, which is generalized training across lots of different areas.
I might start on that because I do teach the buffet model. I do teach the buffet model. With my intro undergraduates, we do a portfolio and we go through a range of methods. And in fact, do that with the graduate students too, in the hopes that they can then locate something that they can sort of drill in on a little bit deeper. And I think that it's like, in some senses, as much as possible, that first digital history course kind of should be a survey course. But that only really works if it's followed by another course. And the chance that there actually is room in a curriculum for it to be followed by another course that lets you get deeper is really, really low still at this point. Because the buffet moves by quickly in the course of a semester, and it gets longer and longer as we keep going. But I'm still trying to do it.
I can jump in as being on the other side of the spectrum from the buffet model. I want to kind of separate here my own preference. I just like coding and modeling. That's something I enjoy. It's not something I think most people should do. It's enormously frustrating most of the time. So I'm going to try and set that to the side. I get this question pretty much every week from students at this point. It's been a huge uptick with the pandemic. Should I learn to code? What should I learn to code? How should I do it? And when I've been teaching Intro to Digital Humanities, I've tried to kind of do a more foundational introduction to humanities programming with a little bit of intro to data analysis. And my thoughts with that was that as much as I love the overview survey, one thing is that those tools do require a lot of time to learn and master. So I don't think it's a faster path at all. And especially for kind of undergraduates, but even earlier graduate students, part of it is I want them to have a more kind of sustainable foundation. But I think it speaks exactly to Sharon's point, is that most of my students after taking that course are like, what's next? And there's nothing, right? And we have a huge gap in digital humanities more broadly. You can take a lot of introductory workshops, which are amazing. That's how I got my start. But what comes afterwards, totally institution dependent. People have gone to do masters in CS, all sorts of places, which is fine, but also seems wildly unsustainable and kind of extremely hard for students to navigate, right? So I think there is ways that we could envision a process that's a little less kind of figure it out yourself. But yeah, I'd love to hear other thoughts.
I can hop in. First, I was thinking we'll have to define what a buffet is for people who've been living in their houses for yeah, I'm also the buffet scholar, but what I'd add to that is I've been increasingly thinking in professional development and working with undergrads and grad students of like my own distinction, which I'm still trying to tease out between the sort of capital D, capital H digital history as the the field that many of us are engaged in, and then the lowercase d digital history of like things that I think you all need to know, that like you're a 14th century medievalist or 14th century scholar, you're a 19th century Canadianist, I'm a 20th century social movement scholar, and trying to think of, I actually think all of you need to know the same thing if you're going to be scholars of any kind. And so I go back and forth in my own digital history seminar, which is big at the graduate level between how much coding should I do, because they want a little bit, the students want tangible skills. And then how much of that sort of methods lifting should I do about like the very basic stuff, like, hey, let's look at how you access your primary sources and, you know, start picking that out in detail. So I've been sort of going on this thing of like lowercase dh and uppercase dh, and I have no clue if that makes sense or if that is something an editor will ever let me write about, but that's been how I've been thinking about this.
And I'll just say, I think you know, clearly the answer is both and that any on-ramp that can be a valuable on-ramp. I mean, just like a generation ago, people were talking about the importance of languages across the curriculum and writing across the curriculum, or speaking and writing across the curriculum. I think at this point, pretty clearly, we need sort of critical thinking about information across the curriculum, and there's no discipline, not just in the humanities or social sciences, there's no discipline where people shouldn't be doing teaching at the undergraduate and, you know, graduate and continuing education level, critical thinking about the information age that we're in. And ideally, there's precisely because, you know, learning the methods involves picking up conceptual tools that are going to be helpful for doing that broader theoretical thinking, and vice versa. I would tend not to sort of fetishize there being any one right answer for, do we make sure that there's a broad DH, capital DH, or smaller lowercase dh out there, but wherever there's a sort of we all need to be building where we are, whatever opportunities we see for increasing both the capacity that we're offering students and the concepts that we're encouraging students to grab onto, it will all push in the direction of being synergistic with the others.
So I think this pushes us well into one of the audience questions. Kimberly asked about how do we convince other liberal arts that our discipline is valuable and that we would benefit from them. Her context is working within cooperative projects. She has been dissed many times, but for myself, you know, as much as I try and discuss, you know, joint curriculums with computer science or with other sort of disciplines across the campus, I'm laughed out of the room if it doesn't come with, you know, lots of money to pay for teaching assistants and other things. So how do you think that plays into sort of this thinking about training and making people understand that history and digital history in particular are valuable?
I can really quickly kick us off. It's funny, Kimberly's question mentioned liberal arts. So I've done a lot of collaboration with computer science, and I found that to be really, at least in our context in Canada, where funding models are different, has been often easier than working with other liberal arts, because in my experience, computer science scholars and then some computational linguistics and stuff, linguists, they're often looking for cool research problems, longitudinal studies, is curious about them. I'm open because I'm tenured to publishing in like CS venues if that's where they want to publish, and it seems to work. But then the challenge is often like English lit or something where we seem so close, and maybe because we seem so close, it's harder to articulate the differentiating factor that history brings to the table, which I think is thick context, which I think is, you know, dealing with primary sources in a sort of contextual way. But it's harder to sell that in a way that a computer scientist who's open-minded is happy to engage. I see some nods from other panelists. Maybe that's resonated or not.
I was just thinking about the grad seminar that I currently teach at Michigan State is a it's a team taught course. I currently have the great bonus of teaching it with Kathleen Fitzpatrick. And it's an interdisciplinary group of students too. And so we spend not all of our time, we spend a lot of our time though, trying to translate to one another what we mean when we're asking these questions. And I think that's actually, aside from all of the digital training, that's actually a super productive and helpful thing to have happen at a baseline required graduate level, because it doesn't happen as well or as fully, just because I think of time and opportunities for engagement across departments in the liberal arts and in my case, histories and social sciences. So that's even more weird. It doesn't happen at the faculty level as often as we would like.
I can jump in here just because I wanted to articulate this in my presentation shortly, and I don't think I fully got there, but I do think there's a a lot of hand waviness around collaboration and cooperation in digital history that can be unhelpful sometimes, right? We're talking about all sorts of different types of collaborations here. You brought up, Jennifer, going to CS departments. Like what are we saying our value is there, right? Is our value just as content expertise versus liberal arts? Is our value kind of some sort of trans-humanities kind of collaboration, right? This is all kind of within the same space. And the thing I really worry about is if collaboration is so central to digital history, how does that fit with the other systems in place within history, right? We are pushing for more collaborative scholarship, which is great, but it's really not for everyone, right? It's, as Ian said, it's a lot easier as a tenured scholar in history, right, than for anyone else. And I think that has become the kind of default assumption when we talk about digital history projects, not in a malicious way, like people are doing massive advocacy work. We've come so far in the last decade alone, but I do think there's a way in which maybe we could be a bit more critical about what collaboration means. And yeah, I see Sharon put up her hand, so I want to give you a chance to interject, Sharon. But yeah, that was just something I was trying to articulate a bit.
Well, and I want to give Lara a chance to answer if she'd like. I have another. I just sort of think that in some the question about do we collaborate with computer scientists, do we collaborate with other people in the humanities? I think the number one people that we fail to effectively collaborate with, who we desperately need to collaborate better with, are our archivists. We have like a shockingly uninformed understanding of what the archival profession is and the way that archivists undertake their work, and the way that it speaks to the questions that Lara has raised about if all the finding aids are digitized and we're accessing them algorithmically, but those finding aids haven't undergone the reparative decolonial work that we'd like them to undergo, we can't access the stuff that we want to access. And so that it's not just on a teach me how to program this level. It's at a much broader level about how we interact with our data and our sources and those sorts of things. That's all.
So I think this is an interesting question about sort of where is the library and archives community in digital history? And I sort of want to open that question. One of the audience members asked about, she's someone who's done this kind of curation work in the past. What is that ideal conversation or partnership with library and information science colleagues? Is it sharing readings? Is it sharing courses? Is it, collaborative projects? Are there examples you can give the audience that you think are a great example of a collaboration between digital historians and library and archives colleagues?
I can hop in to kick us off. I mean, I've been collaborating on my grants and in this Archives Unleashed project, which I run, funded by the Mellon Foundation. And I co-PIs with a librarian who does this. And that's been useful because we go to library conferences, we go to archives conferences. When we bring together stakeholders, we try to have 1/3 from library and archives. And I found that useful to be like, let's try to see what helps your career as a librarian. What are the things that we don't understand that are going on behind the scenes? And I'll note that out of that, it's like more collaborations are coming because you start going down the archival theory rabbit hole. Your eyes start getting open to this stuff that you can't believe you don't know because it seems so obvious. But it just opens up these new frontiers. And my sense of going to archival conferences is, shocked at how few historians are there, and how keen librarians and archivists are to collaborate. The one barrier, and then I'll see what other people think. The one barrier is often the institutional freedom of teaching line, research line faculty, and library line faculty. And trying to get these partnerships, and I know there's frustration of we come up with an idea, but we tend to submit our grants right before the deadline, and that's not enough for workload planning in a library. And I think it requires us to rethink how we articulate our projects and think about actual project management. But I think you can work if you're conscious about it and open with each other and willing to share the money and the publication venues and all that stuff.
I'll just jump in to say that I've been for the last couple of years a special contributing editor for digital initiatives at the American Historical Review. And part of what I'm excited that we now have moving through the pipeline towards publication are some just articles that will bring, hopefully before the AHR readership, which is more where many historians are, just some of the ongoing debates within archival studies, which are so critical and so have like sort of already long ago lapped historians on some of these critical issues of sort of the information studies, ethics, and power, how the power dynamics of digitization and of collaborations of different kinds. And, you know, I'm heartened by the fact that some of by the hope, it's not a fact yet, but the hope that the push towards doing more public facing work as historians, which I think is a real, I mean, it isn't moving as far as in as pervasive or well thought out a way as we could hope, but I think there's historians both in our training of undergraduates and graduate students and in our own work, as we sort of justify our departments to our institutions, are increasingly making cases about how what we do has a broader public than just each other. That's a good thing on balance. And it also, so the push to do more public facing work makes likely more intentional collaborations. So it sort of pushes us to recognize that we need archives and the kinds of institutions that employ them. And hopefully the crucial piece of this is for historians to enter into those dialogues, recognizing that there's a huge amount of conceptual expertise and sophistication that has already been there, waiting for us to start learning as the junior partners in those dialogues.
So I think one of the things that has been long discussed in the library and archives community to various degrees of loudness, I guess, is the question about archives so white. And one of the audience members actually has a question, and I can't tell from the question whether they're referring to digital humanities practice or digital history practice. But the question is about scholars of race and slavery, particularly Jessica Marie Johnston, Vincent Brown, Sophia Noble, and others, have issued major critiques of digital humanities practice. The audience member wants to know, does DH have a racism problem? And I guess I want to turn the question a little bit and say, what should digital history be asking itself right now in regards to race and social justice that we have not, sort of grappled with or thought about openly?
I do not have a definitive answer for this question whatsoever, but I did have a thought for the last question that I think leads into this one a little bit, and it's about the kind of assumptions about who is doing what labor that underlies a lot of digital history work. And I think this is something we need to think about more critically for kind of archivists and librarians. They are doing, like everyone said, enormously exciting work. They are not going to solve all our curation and digitization problems for us, nor should they, right? They have their own practice and their own kind of publics to work with, right? And I think it's important for us to parse that. And I think that comes to this question of what should we be doing more to think about for social justice, is thinking about the ways in which we are building structures that rely on a lot of labor that even if we give credit to, is not sustainable. It's not, something that we can continue. And I think specifically, when thinking about digitizing projects, that's something that historians could be much more involved in for a lot of the interpretive choices, but also for thinking about the life cycle of these projects, right? It's not just enough to build it and they'll come. There's all sorts of curation work and building community work that goes into that.
I don't know that I have a definitive answer either, but it's related to Zoe's response and the earlier question. And so the folks cited in the question, Jessica Marie Johnson and a whole host of other people, are doing really, really important work, and it's work that we should all be reading and engaging with. And I'm thinking about my current collaborative project, which is designed from top to bottom to be a collaboration between historians and archival professionals to create a data model to describe the lived experiences of enslaved people. It purposefully hits some of those key points in a way that I hope that it is in the service of creating a model for future work to happen. And so in creating the data model, we're collaborating on one level that speaks to the kinds of respect about institutional and disciplinary expertise that Laura's talking about. So the historians and the archivists working together to think about how we build the container to describe the material represented in the archival materials. But the important point of doing it with these particular materials is it's about a way of surfacing historical evidence about the human lives impacted by the horrible and destructive institutions of slavery in a way that puts their experiences front and center, as opposed to putting the experiences of their owners, who in this case happen to be colleges and universities, or their employers, front and center. It's an effort to turn that narrative, and to do it in a way that produces usable, ethically created, carefully decided production of data in a system that hopefully doesn't create the kinds of labor burdens that Zoe is thinking about. But it is just one project. And so the question is, how do we start to build those kinds of collaborative processes and questions about power relations into all of the projects that we undertake, and the kinds of things that we can conceive of collaboratively and not collaboratively.
So one of our audience members actually points to that and asks about, is there something like the open science framework principles in terms of decision points and reproducibility and reliability and ethics? And I wonder a little bit, I'm going to actually marry it to a question Jim McGrath had about the ethics of labor in the field of digital history. How do you think, in terms of future directions in research and teaching for students, we talk to them about these questions about, the ethics of what we do and how we do it, when, as I think what Jim's question alludes to, a lot of what we're doing is inside of a system that itself is very broken and relies on underpaid adjuncts, underpaid labor, precarious labor. How do we talk to our students about those questions, or how do we position ourselves in terms of those concerns?
Yeah, I think those are critical questions, and they become even more so the more we notice the international dimensions of our work as well, so that it's not just about people within the sort of nearby. So it's both about the sort of what are the ethics of our practice, of the labor practices of the systems that we're replicating and inhabiting immediately around us, but it's also about the international dimensions of how resources and rewards are flowing. Hopefully there's a really, generational differences of power hierarchies shaped by generation are important in lots of different pieces of society, but all the more so in a world in which, people a generation before me, have gotten, where the institution of tenure was widely available in a prior era of scholarship, pretty available when I was a young lass, almost not available. So there's this, it's not just that people acquire more age and stature, but we've literally baked in protections that are widely shared among people who already have the power, a disproportionate amounts of power and security, and enormously scarce for the folks who are, doing the most cutting edge work in this area. So that's unsustainable. Which is just to say, it's a critical question. I don't think anyone has the answers, and they're also not totally unique to academia even, right? Like the question of, we need to recognize the pieces of our practice within academia that are replicating sort of the gig economy of Uber and of Amazon warehouses. We need to recognize the similarities and then think about how we can structure, push against the technological and sort of political economy forces that are driving these disparities to be worse.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for this, and I should talk about it more, but as somebody who does digital history and public history, the only thing I want to say is that our colleagues who are constantly saying, oh, let's just add a lunchtime brown bag on X and Y so then our grad students will have a better chance in the job market, are full of, they don't know what they're talking about. I'll leave it at that.
So I think that actually takes us right into two different questions in our audience group. Cameron Blevins obviously asked about, everybody talked a little bit about needing more. We need more courses, we need more faculty, we need more tenure lines. That's obviously something, as one of the few digital humanists at my university, resonates with me. I would love to be cloned so that I don't have to be teaching the same introductory course over and over again. His question though is about scarcity, looking towards the future of the university and the future of the profession, with so few tenure lines, declining enrollment, all of these things, what does training look like if there isn't more to be had?
I can take a quick stab. I mean, I think there's something going on. Thanks for the question, Cameron. I mean, there's something going on with the job market right now where I think we're clearly seeing some pushing in some American institutions of like these interdisciplinary digital positions that are spanning disciplines, that are spanning units where the library is involved, or they're split with it's a cluster hire or something like that. And so I know there's been some discussion on Twitter and there's been backlashes, but certain parts of the job market are behaving differently to these pressures. And there's something going on around digital literacy and stuff like that. So I think part of that is trying to push these collaborative lines of like trying to make the case within our departments of like, yeah, maybe we can't actually unite. Our department's too fractious. We can't unite behind a position. But what if we could partner with English on a digital position, or partner with the computer science on a 51-49 position, and find some way to partner and push that forward? And I think that's possible if we have enough, responding to that last question, enough like thinking about credit, thinking about co-authorship, thinking about how we can value this work. The AHA and the AHR are doing great things to encourage this. And if we can normalize interdisciplinary scholarship, it makes it tangible to ethically hire someone who's in a split line and get them through the tenure process.
If I could just jump in, because these have all been great thoughts or questions and responses, and I have a ton of thoughts here. This is really the question that's kind of animating my presentation, right? Like we are kind of in this bottleneck moment of extreme scarcity, extreme precarity. How do we talk about the future of this field at all? And, I think Lara's, point that this is broader than academia alone absolutely should be first the guiding light, right? We need to focus on, organizing, mobilizing, mutual aid networks, all these things. There's some great stuff going on specifically around kind of postdocs organizing and these kind of things that I think absolutely should be more support. But I think specifically to digital history, I think this is where that question of computational becomes a really interesting path potentially for some institutions, right? And I think that's what I was trying to see here, is that can that be a way for us to advocate for more resources here? But I think if we do that, there needs to be a real focus on thinking about graduate training, right? Right now, we are asking people to do digital history dissertations, maybe not asking them, maybe they're demanding, hopefully that's the case, maybe they're excited by this, but it's very unclear the expectations, right? And it's very unclear the amount of support available. And I think that it's really going to shape the future of this field, right? If we don't figure out this problem, I don't see a path forward within history departments, at least. Other places, maybe. So that's where I would push a lot of the organizing and activity. And like Ian said, it could look like, pushing for these kind of co-hires. This is where the data science boom could be of use to us. But then that means we need to teach some sort of programming within this discipline, which it hasn't really been set up for yet. So that's a big question about pedagogy. It's a big question about what gets displaced. And that's a tough thing to navigate today in that kind of the moment where we are, where it's massive scarcity.
So I think it's useful to pause here on Jerry Moringa's question about, she wants to hear from the panel about their experiences and the differences between support for scholarship that is narrative driven versus scholarship that is computationally driven. and sort of focuses on computational methods for historical research and how that relates to the future of digital history. Because if Zoe is saying that computational and data science is one way of garnering new resources, I think that question becomes even more important about, have you seen a difference in how your own scholarship or the scholarship of your students is positioned and received based on whether it's more narrative or computational?
Or not being received, as the case may be. I mean, like being like, oh, that sounds interesting. Glad you got funding for it. Come back when you're done and give me some sort of compelling narrative that arises from it. Yeah, I think it's a Jerry's right. As usual, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and we have to think in a very concerted way with our colleagues about widening their understanding of what scholarly products look like and how they can be produced.
Yeah, I can just echo that. I mean, I'd say collaborate with a Canadian, because I think north of the border, because we have sort of the one central funding agency for us, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, has been really, and it was headed by Chad Gaffield, who is a digital historian, which helps, but it's been really expensive of like, you have to think about diverse knowledge mobilization. We don't really want to fund just books. We like books, but if you want to do a book, do some compelling case about some other object. The natural outcome is digital history scholarship. And I think that's really helped, where it's almost hard to get funding in Canada, I think, with some selection committees on a straight up monograph project, but you have to articulate this extra vision. So, I mean, part of it would be, find Canadians to collaborate. We always need international collaborators. And we're trying to push the boundaries of that. And a SSHRC grant holds water at a Canadian tenure committee, I think more than a grant might at an equivalent R1 in the United States. I mean, I think there's different affordances in Canada, but it's really opened stuff up, I think, for Canadians to experiment with blogging and databases and getting those accepted by departments, thanks to that sort of stamp from our federal government, which was, of course, shaped by a digital historian.
If I can jump in here, thanks for the question, Jerry. It's a great question. We've talked about this a lot. I agree with everything Ian says, but I think there's a way in which, again, we're talking about people within a faculty position that have access to these resources, right? So in terms of kind of reception to this work, I think there's a big question of what's happening in graduate programs. Is it okay? Where does your computational work live in your dissertation is a big question mark right now. There's some models out there, but I think it's something we could give a lot more clarity, and it would help the future of the field generally. I do think, though, that we have talked a lot about this question of narrative versus methods in the last decade, right? There's been a lot of pieces on this already. And I do think it's a question of why is it still so challenging? It's probably just hard, right, to balance this. But I do think there's questions about what's missing maybe in the publication landscape. Do we need an additional journal that's more kind of focused on that kind of interactive data journalism model that, is right now kind of just living on most people's individual websites? Does that need to be a space that we can publish? Yeah, I think it's a good question of what institutionally is lacking, because we've talked about this, quite a few times now of, how to balance the two. And I'm just wondering, why is it still such a struggle? Maybe it comes down to, again, this chicken and egg problem. We're not training people to do this. And so how do we expect to see it?
Yeah. And if I can jump in, it's also that, I think the idea that there's a dichotomy between computational narrative, those exist within different planes, right? So the other works that might be more, or terms that might be more useful for us is, thinking in terms of scholarly infrastructure and asynchronous collaboration and public-facing work. So noticing that actually monographs are part of scholarly infrastructure, because monographs have a value that isn't just limited to the people who read them cover to cover, right? They become part of collective knowledge in ways that will help other people find other things. But similarly, creating a data set is creating part of scholarly infrastructure. It has a half-life that can, a monograph has the advantage of being a form that doesn't rely on a single technology to be able to sustain it. But on the other hand, we can think of ways in which these are similar to each other and ways in which all of these, making the case for the monograph, which increasingly needs to be explicitly made, should be helping us also make the case for the value and the intellectual work that goes into creating the data set, and the value and the intellectual work that goes into creating the public facing form. So that some of the same questioning of the value of quote unquote traditional scholarly production should actually be pushing us towards coming up with a new vocabulary and a better explicit articulation of what we collectively are out here doing that would help us see these all of these different components as distinct along multiple dimensions, but actually all valuable and interconnected and interdependent.
So I want to sneak in a little bit of a question of my own. So I think this question about value, we have a number of people in the audience who've asked about, what constitutes a successful collaboration, what constitutes a successful project, what constitutes a successful curriculum. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about where success fits in digital history as sort of a pilot of things. Part of the reason why I ask this is that I think there's a real sort of fear about failure in digital history because there is so much resistance to what we do, particularly for people who are at smaller institutions, who are lower resource, but also for people who are trying to push their department or their program or their school towards more robust training curriculums for their graduate students. There seems to be a lot of resistance to talking about sort of what happens when you're building these things that can go awry. What do we learn from in terms of digital history and failure? And I wonder if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about sort of where you think digital history is. We're conservatively 4 decades in digital history, and yet it feels like we're 5 minutes into defending what we're doing. And I wonder if you guys could speak a little bit about that.
And just note that, when was the last time we heard a historian talk about failure in the process of their monograph creation? Like, we as a field don't talk about that. We just say, well, it took me 20 years to write this book, and I'm not going to tell you why. Right. And so I think that, that's a question that we can all ask and answer. And it's like, things go badly sometimes, but I don't know that I necessarily interpret it as failure unless it was something I was supposed to be doing under a clock and the clock ran out, which means it was probably grant funded. And if it was grant funded, there's success in getting the grant and lack of success in achieving the deliverables that you promised. But the grant's already come, and so you learned something from it and those sorts of things. And so you got some credit for getting the thing, and but still not as much credit as if you had published a book. So that's not an answer at all. It's just sort of a set of additional problems to be added to your very good and important question.
Yeah, I can build off that. I mean, I think that's a great that's a great way to think about it. That we need to be more open about failure. And the monograph model is like an all hands on deck. It's such a high stakes undertaking to do, and I think we're getting better at articles and book chapters as well, and seeing those as important waystones along the way. Yeah, and I also just highlight, there's also lots of probably projects that think they're failures, but are actually successful because we've all built on them. They've had blog posts, they've had great literature. Like, I think of digging into data projects that for whatever reason don't end up in publications, but I cite their final grant report until it disappears from the Digging Into Data website. So I think maybe it's like encouraging people to think of, and maybe I should be better at this too, of saying, I've used your final grant report 7 times and I'm citing it all the time. You should consider publishing it in a journal, and probably it would get published. But for whatever reason, because it hasn't led to that monograph they might have envisioned, it sits in that gray literature like so much digital humanities scholarship.
Yeah, I think this is a great question that's operating at a number of different levels, right? And I think Ian pointed to this a little bit of like, for a lot of digital projects, sustainability and kind of long-term existing is somehow success, but why that is sometimes unquestioned, right? So there's ways in which success, we might be kind of defining it on a kind of digital humanities basis, not necessarily in a way that makes sense to historians. But I think it's interesting your point about kind of the pushback against digital history within history departments, right? Like this, you know, if you don't have this big grant, why are we going to invest this time into it? It's a very kind of transactional, you know, and there is this way in which I think, yeah, we are both seen as being able to marshal a lot of resources, but when that doesn't happen, it also kind of blows up and it's like, well, what's the purpose of this then, right? And I think that's a really tricky thing to navigate. And I don't, I don't really have any advice except to say that I think we're all pointing to the ways in which digital history can enrich kind of historical research broadly, right? So that's probably the kind of community building, and it probably speaks to the fact that at least for people that were lucky enough to get faculty positions, a lot of them don't have opportunities to train in this, to learn about this, right? So there might be another kind of training gap there that is creating this kind of maybe sense again of scarcity and competition and lack of understanding of the kind of intellectual and interpretive contributions of this field. But yeah, that's maybe not, I don't know.
So this was actually one of the audience questions, is about where might historians seeking specialized expertise in computational practices go to enhance their own training? Do you guys have favorite resources, favorite books, favorite training institutes, favorite workshops, favorite projects that you turn to when you're thinking about your own training? Because I know, you know, I'm old enough to be of a generation where I learned my training on the internet by stealing things from other people because there were no digital history classes when I was getting my degrees. I mean, that was just not there. So are there things you could point people to that sort of enriched what you guys learn and sort of grow with?
I'll start. I mean, I missed that camps because that was probably where I was back in the olden days. But I say along those lines, like workshops. So Code for Lib, I've been to that conference twice, I think. And like there's been pre-conference workshops, and it's both an opportunity to learn new skills, but also to talk to people in different domains. So in that case, just being at like linked data was my real introduction at a library workshop. And I learned something in the workshop, but I also had a lunch afterwards and talked. Remember when we had lunch together? You know, I had a chance to talk to people about their experiences and just sort of seeking that out. So for me, it's a lot of those in-person things, and also getting on listservs and like going to talks in the computer science department. That's like a 15-minute walk from my building. But then they do cool stuff and they're excited to see people. But if I didn't actually subscribe to lists, I'd have no clue. They wouldn't reach out to me necessarily.
I'm the same age as you are, Jen. And so I said, like, I only learned it on the internet. And so in that sense, I would say, you know, things like if you're going to go that route, some of the data carpentry stuff, some of the library carpentry stuff. But every time we turn around, we get somebody like Zoe who's created a course in GitHub that you can just sort of work your way through if you want to learn D3 or those sorts of things. And so I think the difference about those is somebody who is coming to them with a problem to be solved, a need for the additional professional development that makes sense of the generic approach that one of those sort of non-specialized purveyors might provide. And so without that motivating force, it sort of doesn't totally work.
Just a small plug also for the programming historian, which Ian, I thought you were going to say, but that's also a great resource, and community that's been going on now for quite some time. So that's also there. And Scott Weingart actually has a great blog post on learning how to code. So highly recommend that as well.
So Heather Froelich has a question about, do we have stories of success of trying to get digital skills into the curriculum without the formal designation of digital humanities or digital project for historians? And I think sort of what's motivating that is her question about, you know, is there a way to make training more seamless rather than less in sort of our approach to the future? And I guess what could AHA do to help with this is one of the questions I always come back to, because like the digital history working group they have is awesome, but like that's tenure guidelines, and the majority of digital historians are not on the tenure track, I don't think.
I would actually love to see the AHA provide not just simply advanced workshops, but actually more scaffolded curriculum. There's a lot of introduction to programming that it's best to teach with a kind of STS kind of combination, but it's not necessary. It's not requisite, right? You can do a 2-week boot camp to kind of learn a bit. And then if you had a course or a community afterwards to kind of build upon that, I think that's one way where we could do this a bit more seamlessly. I think it's also just moving away from the assumption that people are going to teach themselves, which we still have baked into the more computational work. So if we're thinking that there needs to be this kind of scaffolded curriculum, maybe the AHA could be a site for starting to build that. Yeah.
It reminds me of something that Jeff McClurkin has talked about for forever, and we can't have a conversation about digital history without talking about Jeff, I think, for good reasons. But has talked about for a really, really long time, and that is the notion that one doesn't have to teach digital history course. One can have a digitally inflected course that has a drop-in of a particular, particular exercise. For that to work, there has to be a broad distribution of digital skills across the faculty. And that continues now as I started my remarks, 8 or 10 years later, that's still a huge gap. And so we got to think about ways to solve that. And when I made that plea in 2013 for mid-career training for historians, I made it to the AHA, and the people who answered, bless them, were the NEH. But the NEH can't answer for forever. And so maybe as an organization, we might consider how to do something, as Zoe suggests, in a more sustained way.
So I think this helps get us to one of the final few questions we have. April, one of the attendees was asking about, is there a way for us to encourage projects, databases, et cetera, to provide teaching curriculum with their projects? Is there a way for us to sort of make bridges between the project, the pedagogy, and the classroom, so that what we're seeing on the research side is able to proliferate more through to the teaching side, particularly for people who aren't digitally fluent? I mean, I'm sitting on a panel with probably some of the most digitally fluent people I know, but there's tons of areas as a digital historian that I am a beginner teacher in, much less a beginner researcher in. And is there a way for us to talk about sort of encouraging that work of translation to curriculum in all digital projects that historians do?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things most exciting to me is a lot of digital projects are starting to make their data available, which I think is one first step towards this and starting to provide nice documentation. I'm thinking of your project, Sharon, like the enslaved.org is really phenomenal, and I just recommended it to a student this past week. But I do think there's a way in which we are just starting to kind of have conversations about what does pedagogy for data literacy and computational literacy look like in history, right? That's where we're kind of coming to at this moment, and we're probably have been talking about it for some time, but I think there's a way here where maybe these projects are the best avenue if they are providing these data exports and doing this kind of overview analysis. Maybe something like a kind of blog post where you're kind of helping teachers scaffold this in would be really useful. But I tend to use data sets from humanities projects, and that's been really helpful for getting students to kind of start thinking through the questions while they're learning the kind of coding aspects as well.
I should note while I can that Enslaved is not my project. It's it's a project of Matrix, which is the big digital history center here, and I consult on it. But there's a giant team of folks who are working on that aggregation, and those projects have that in their roadmap, and more of them should.
So that gets us to one of the questions: are there best practices available or documented norms for releasing publicly available data sets for digital history projects? Does anyone know of any that are specific to history?
Not history, but there's data sheets for data sets, which is really a great paper that I could maybe post on Twitter or link in the chat. That is one I've recommended, but yeah, not history specific.
Yeah, the FAIR data principles, so the Santa Barbara statement from the Collections as Data group. Yeah. There are things floating around, but I don't think there are any specific to history.
So, I mean, that sounds like one area where AHA might assist in organizing an effort, because I do think that there are distinctions in historical practice that do matter in these types of documentation efforts, particularly when we get into the issue about the ethics of particular data sets related to enslaved or indigenous peoples. I mean, Zoe mentioned my article on cultural analytics. I mean, that's what that whole article is about can we work ethically with digitized indigenous photographs given the fact that they're created in trauma. And I think most of us work in those areas. I mean, I think about, you know, Ian's work in the early internet. None of that shit was copyright privacy based. So our final question, as we run out of time, is about whether or not you see digital and computational driving quantitative history, and where digital history might overlap with other traditionally either mathematical or social science-based disciplines. You know, where are we with everyone else, I guess?
Well, Ben Schmidt's talk told us we are not with them. Like that was the entire argument, which was persuasive, right? I think there's different, the kind of modeling work happening in political science or economics is very sophisticated and not necessarily easily translatable. But I do think there is areas like computational social science or quantitative literary studies that there is a bit more overlap, as well as kind of collections as data in the library spaces. But yeah, I'm not sure how much it's driving digital history. I think digital history is being driven actually by other areas that are doing enormously exciting research. So, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think the one area I find it interesting, which might contribute to other discussions too, is we're so used to our really messy and incomplete data sets, which I think part when you see that taken to the, I mean, thinking of like Peter Turkin's thing, right? Like there's these, you know, really, really big claims being made about, you know, history as a science and how we can move forward. And then I think some of our hesitation often is everybody should know their data sets are biased and have all these problems and stuff like that. But like, we should really know that. And I think that's a contribution we can make to these conversations as well as historians, to say, you know, maybe we're not at the forefront of this because our data is so messy, and maybe that in turn can help shed light onto how that field can also move forward.
All right, well, thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to throw it back to Debbie so that she can close us out. I want to remind you that all of the panelists are on Twitter and social media. So if you have other questions, I think they will be happy to entertain them there, and share resources as well.
All right, thank you. That concludes our webinar for today. As I said at the beginning, a recording will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. You can also find recordings of past virtual AHA events on the channel as well. I'd like to express thanks again to our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions and contributed to the conversation in the chat. This was a really engaged conversation today. It was very nice to see. And finally, a special thanks to all of our panelists today. Have a good day and stay warm out there.